How do you explain? How do you describe a love that goes from east to west?
Hello again. Last time we discussed Christianity and abortion. In this lesson, I decided to go ahead and throw it in. We're going to discuss infanticide. And the reason I decided to throw it in is because historically these two topics, they go together, and especially with relation to Christianity, they definitely go together because it seems like it's always been an uphill battle, and it's always been a battle since the origins of Christianity in the first century. But when we look at this, we're going to go back and look at Deuteronomy chapter 12, verse 29 through 31. We've already looked at how God looks at children in the last lesson. We looked at that text from Matthew where Jesus is referring to children coming to him. They're trying to stop the children from coming to him because they don't want the children to get into his way. But Jesus looks at them and chastises them for their actions. He says, "Let them come to me." And then he goes on to say that if you cause one of these little ones to stumble, it's better to have a millstone wrapped around her neck and cast into the sea. In other words, we get a good idea of how God looks at children, how God looks at small children, and the love and compassion that he has for them. Well, when we look at this in the Old Testament, Deuteronomy chapter 12, 29 through 31, it says, "When the Lord your God cuts off before you the nations whom you go in to dispossess, and you dispossess them and dwell in their lands, take care that you be not ensnared to follow them after they have been destroyed before you, and that you do not inquire about their gods, saying, How did these nations serve their gods, that I may also do the same? You shall not worship the Lord your God in this way, for every abominable thing that the Lord hates they have done for their gods." Now listen to this, "For they even burn their sons and their daughters into the fire for their gods." You kind of see what God is saying here. God is telling the nation of Israel through Moses, they've just left the land of Egypt and Egyptian bondage. They're coming into the promised land, the land of Canaan, and the people that live in Canaan at this time are actually their relatives and descendants from their relatives. If you go back and you look at Genesis and you look at Abraham and his cousins and his children and grandchildren, with Esau and the Edomites and different people, when you look at all of these relatives, they're pretty related to the nation of Israel. But yet they've kind of fallen into this path of following these idols and these false gods, and God is condemning their actions, and he's warning the nation of Israel not to do the things that they do. And it amazes me the example that he gives for the magnitude of their abominations. He says they even offer their children to their gods. And it's interesting that you really don't find that in Christianity. You don't find that in Judeo-Christianity. You really just don't see that in the Bible. You don't see children being sacrificed to Yahweh, which is interesting because in this day and time, especially in the times of Deuteronomy and when that was written, it was very common for human sacrifice to happen for these gods. So God condemns their action and says the magnitude of their abominations even goes as far as killing their children. You see a little bit better idea of how God looks at children. In Leviticus chapter 18, verse 21, it says, "You shall not give any of your children to offer them to Molech, and so profane the name of your God and the Lord." He gets very specific in Leviticus, saying, do not follow Molech. Do not follow him. You offer your children to them. Do not take part in this abomination. Well, by the time we get to the Babylonian captivity, roughly 600 years before the time of Christ, you have three major prophets that prophesy. You have Daniel, Ezekiel, and Jeremiah. And this is a long time after those commands were given in Deuteronomy and Leviticus. But look what happens to the nation of Judah. The nation of Israel has already been taken away into Assyrian captivity about 100 years before this. But you have the nation of Judah who's still trying to follow God, but you have people doing this. Jeremiah chapter 32, verse 35 says, "They built the high places of Baal in the valley of the son of Hinnom to offer up their sons and their daughters to Molech, though I did not command them, nor did it enter into my mind. They should do this abomination to cause Judah to sin." It says it didn't even enter into my mind that you would offer your children in this way. But yet they built these high places for Baal, and they're offering their children up to Molech by passing them through fire. And we see that that's in the valley of the son of Hinnom. Now, interesting point about this valley. That's the same valley that Jesus uses to reference eternal damnation and is translated hell in the New Testament, or Gehenna. Other texts we could look at is Deuteronomy 18:10, 2 Kings 16:3, 17:7, and so on and so forth. You have those there. You can go back and look at them, and I encourage you to do that. When we get to the New Testament, we have Stephen in Acts chapter 7, who's really the first Christian martyr. And he stands up before the Jewish leaders, and he gives them a real good dose of Jewish history. And he's talking about Pharaoh whenever the nation of Israel is under bondage in Egypt before Moses leads them out. He's talking about Pharaoh in verse 19. He says, he dealt shrewdly with our race and forced our fathers to expose their infants so that they would not be kept alive. Now I have expose and infants there bolded for a reason. Expose is that same type of mentality, is the same word that's used in ancient Greek and used a lot of times by early Christians because that's the language they used was Greek. It's used to either refer to people intentionally taking their children out or electively taking their children out after they're born because they don't want to accept them into the family and letting them die by the elements. And it's used in this context to talk about how Pharaoh made the nation of Israel, or the Hebrews, take their children out and let them die by the elements. But it's that same idea of exposing your children is basically infanticide, killing these newborn infants. Now, I've got infants bolded as well because it's the same word that's used back in Luke chapter 1 and Luke chapter 2 to refer to John the Baptist while he's in the womb and Jesus while he's in the manger, showing again that God looks at a baby, a newborn, the same way that he looks at a child while it's in the womb. And I've got the Greek word up there for expose, ekthetos. It's just up there for a reference. Other texts besides the Bible, again, we have the commentaries that are written by early Christians in the 2nd and 3rd centuries, and sometimes late 1st century. But Justin Martyr, he warns against exposure. Again, the Didache and the Epistle of Barnabas that we looked at last lesson, they condemn exposing infants just right along the side of abortion there as well. I like Clement of Alexandria's quote from Instructor 3 verse 4. He says, and though talking about women of the culture of the Greco-Roman world that the Christians found themselves in, it says, and though maintaining parrots and curlews, they do not receive the orphan child, but they expose children that are born at home and take up the young of birds and prefer irrational to rational creatures. I like this text for several reasons. One, it kind of gives me a good idea of what Christians dealt with back then. And sometimes when we feel that we live in a time where morals are kind of upside down, they were dealing with the same type stuff. Here it shows these individuals, these women, they did not care about their children. They would take them out and have them exposed, but they would take these small animals in and care for them. And he's just showing the reverse nature of the culture's morality that they found themselves in as early Christians. And the other thing that it reminds me of is how our culture today really hasn't changed. A lot of times we think this is 2 millennia ago, we think that people have changed. People have not changed. Times have maybe changed a little bit due to technology, but people as a whole have not changed. The problems that people have not changed, whether it's the lust of the eyes, lust of the flesh, or the pride of life. They're the same problems. They're the same issues. We have newer toys. We have different substances to be abused. We have different avenues for practicing idolatry and abominations, but people as a whole have not changed. And when we look around today, the same type mentality goes on. You have to pay a $200,000 to $300,000 fine if you destroy an eagle's egg, but yet you can kill the unborn that's in a mother's womb, and it's considered a choice. And just seeing the upside down nature of morality that we still prefer as a culture, as Western civilization, it appears that we prefer irrational creatures. We will take animals and we will care for them, and we shouldn't abuse animals, which I'm not saying we should. I'm not saying that we should abuse animals or mistreat animals by any means. In fact, that was one of the first jobs God gave Adam in the garden, was to tend his garden, to take care of his garden, to take care of the land, take care of the animals, and have dominion over it, but to care for it as God has cared for them. So I'm not saying that we shouldn't take care of animals. It just saddens me to see that people get up in arms whenever an animal gets abused, but yet when a child gets abused or when a child is aborted, it's just overlooked. It's considered part of a choice. And I think a lot of this, and I'm going to kind of get off track here a little bit, I think a lot of this would be remedied if we could show an abortion online. Just show an active abortion, since part of our funding goes toward Planned Parenthood in the U.S. and our tax dollars. Since that goes on, since we consider this such a choice for women and for individuals that want to have abortions, why not show a video of it? We can show a video of other surgical procedures, heart surgery, lung bypass, or whatever. We can show all different types of surgeries. Why not show abortion if it's just a procedure? If it's and especially in the cases of minors, it's the one thing that a minor doesn't have to have parental consent for. And I understand that rape and incest is a big issue there, but it baffles me the hypocrisy that goes into this one topic. And again, $200,000 to $300,000 for destroying an eagle egg, but yet you destroy a child while it's in the womb, and it's called a choice. We're going to close with this text here, 2 Samuel chapter 11 and chapter 12. And I'm going to look at this just to show the difference between God's people and their culture towards children versus our culture towards children as far as Western civilization. In chapter 11, chapter 12, David and Bathsheba, they sin. They commit fornication, and David has Bathsheba's husband killed because she becomes pregnant, and he wants to hide this sin of this fornication because the husband wasn't in town. All right. Now, I'm not saying that what David did was correct. In fact, God gives him a pretty stern condemnation for his actions here, and he has to suffer for them. But when it comes to the child that comes into this world because of this sin, because of this fornication that was committed, it's very interesting how David responds. He doesn't grieve the child. He doesn't have animosity toward the child. In fact, the child becomes ill, and David is praying and fasting that this child may survive. And this child is a direct result from his sin, from his iniquity. And whenever you look at Bathsheba, it's a direct result from her sin with David. So it's very interesting to see how David responds to this child being born. In this day and time, I was watching a show the other day, and these two individuals, they were dating, hadn't been dating long, they were adults, but one of them became pregnant, and they were asking the question, should we keep the child? And it's interesting that David, that was never a consideration. They didn't talk about exposing the child to the elements to have the child put to death. They weren't talking about abortion. We know that roughly a millennia before the time of Christ, abortion existed from the Middle Assyrian laws that we looked at last time. But when we look at this text, David doesn't consider that. He doesn't consider this child as something that's a curse. He sees the child as a blessing, even though is it a direct result of his sin and also a sign of his sin with Bathsheba. So I think we could take a lot of insight about how God looks at children by the way his people look at children. Even when David did something stupid and sinned against God, he did not take it out on the child.